as somebody who's pressing the case for, yes, it's bad and worse than you know, and immediate action is required. And we can maybe kick it off on where you guys agree, because I can remember when I first started at Fox News back in 2004, I guess it was. We were still at the point then, at least on Fox, where people we'd have on would debate whether we were even experiencing warming, right? And if we are experiencing more warming, is any of it attributable to man, right? Like that we were still at that point. I think everyone here agrees we're past that point. We are warming. The earth is warming, and women are causing it for the most part. Maybe not 100%, but it's what we've done and are doing that's causing it. Do you guys, just quickly, do you both agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So that's where we're going to start from that premise, and figure out how bad is it and what can be done about it. That's sort of our focus today. So, David, your essay and then your book say it's bad. It's really bad, and we really do need to be alarmed. And when I read the book, I was alarmed. I was picking up what you were putting down. I felt better after I read Bjørn, but you, just to put it in perspective, are saying we are speeding blithely along to more than 4 degrees Celsius of warming by the year 2100. That could mean a sea level rise of between 4 and 8 feet. Now, this is our children who are alive right now. You know, I've got a 12, 10, and 8-year-old. You've got a new baby, I understand, would experience this, God willing. You know, they'd still be around. So this is not that far off in the future. You say whole regions of Africa and Australia and the United States, parts of South America, Asia, south of Siberia would be rendered uninhabitable if that happened. And go on to talk about how we could eventually see Miami Beach as a new Atlantis, city underwater. We could see more than 30 million people dealing with water scarcity, major cities along the equator becoming unlivable. Even in northern latitudes, heat waves that would kill thousands each summer, massively deadly heat waves in India and elsewhere, 5 times as long, 32 times as much extreme heat. And you describe that would be with just 2 degrees warming by 2100 as the best case scenario. So let me kick it to you from there and say, where are you now since you've written your book on best case scenario for 2100, and is it as bad as you predicted in that book? Do you still believe that?
Well, the book was looking at warming scenarios mostly in this range of 2 degrees Celsius of warming to 4 or 4.5 degrees of warming. And actually, since I wrote it and since it was published, I do think we're much likelier to end up on the better half of that range than the worse half of that range. I think something between 2 and 3 as opposed to 3 and 4, and maybe even between 2 and 2.5 is our likely future. I think that's in part because of market forces, because the cost of renewables have fallen really dramatically, making very appealing investment, especially for the developing world, which is planning almost a from scratch energy build out. It's also because of political pressure and the changing perspective on the economics of climate change from where we were a decade or so ago, when much of this may have seemed moral to economists to undertake. It now seems like actually an opportunity for greater prosperity in the medium and long term. And I think that consensus has really shifted the direction of policy, which combined with the market forces and the political change means that I think our baseline expectation should be something like 3 or 2.5 degrees, and we're certainly in sight of something like 2 degrees of warming. Now, that is a best case scenario based on where we were a few years ago, I think. But it also is not fine. It's a level of warming that climate scientists have long warned is catastrophic. It would mean, some estimates say, 150 million additional people dying from the air pollution that's produced by the burning of those fossil fuels, storms that used to hit storms and flood events that used to hit once every century, hitting perhaps every single year. As you mentioned, cities in the Middle East and South Asia regularly being so hot during summer that walking around outside, working outside would represent a real risk of heat stroke and for some death. And, by some estimates, the possibility of climate refugees numbering in the hundreds of millions and possibly more. Now, all of those predictions may not come precisely true at 2 degrees, but when you put together the whole body of climate science, it's not a pretty picture. It is only half the story. Human adaptation and resilience is the other half. But where I come from on this primarily is the understanding that we are already now outside the window of temperatures that have enclosed the entire history of human civilization. So from the dawn of agriculture to the development of modern nation states and where we are today, all of that took place under climate conditions we've already left behind. We can live in the new future. We can live in a future of 2 degrees, at least in some parts of the world. But it will be an incredibly difficult task to adapt and respond to it, especially in the global south, where they have the least resources to do that build out, are most vulnerable to direct climate impacts, and have done the least to actually cause the scale of warming that is now inevitable. So from some perspective, I'm considerably more optimistic than I was a few years ago. But I think it's also worth keeping in mind that because of decades of inaction, decades which have enclosed record carbon emissions every single year, we are now in a very different place than in terms of what a best case scenario looks like than, say, 20 or 30 years ago, when at climate conferences we might have said we were going to avoid dangerous climate change. That's no longer possible. Dangerous climate change is already here. The question is, how dangerous is it going to get? What can we do to limit that warming? And what can we do to respond on the back end to make sure that human flourishing is, maximal, optimal, given the climate conditions that we have already made inevitable?
All right, Bjørn. So do you agree that the likely outcome that we're looking at here is by 2100, global warming of 2 degrees Celsius, which again, according to what I read, would be our best case scenario, according to most these climate scientists say 2 degrees at this point would be a win, but nobody thinks it's a great thing. But do you think that's correct? Do you think we're looking at 2 degrees warming by 2100?
2 or 3 degrees, just like David is saying. And again, this is not surprising because we're using the same scenarios and we're using the same models. So yes, it is a better outlook. But we also have to be very careful. A lot of this comes from us hoping that countries far into the future will be cutting what they're promising to cut. But remember, our experience in the past has certainly not been that people and countries live up to what they promised. So, a reservation, an asterisk on that. But yes, we are likely to see 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, or upwards of 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century.
So that sounds bad, right? So why are you not alarmed? Why aren't you jumping up and down like David?
So it's important to get a sense of proportion. And I think this is really the conversation that we'll probably be having for most of the next hour and a half. It's a question of saying, how bad is this going to be? Overall, global warming is a problem. That's uncontrovertible. That's what we just started off, and you asked us to sort of point out. But it's how bad is it compared to all the other challenges that humanity is facing? And of course, also at the same time, and David was very right in saying this, adaptation and human resilience means that many of these scenarios will actually not only not come to pass, but they will become much, much better than the living conditions and the human flourishing that we're seeing right now. We will be in a much better state. And what climate change really means is, instead of being in a phenomenally much better place, we'll only be in a slightly less phenomenally much better place. It's a question of saying climate change slows down progress. It slows down human flourishing rather than this is the end of the world. And I think that's the big difference. A lot of people that listen to the news think global warming is the end of the world, and it's certainly being sold that way. If you listen to Biden and many other politicians, they will regularly say, this is an existential problem. No, it's not. It's nowhere near that. That's not what the UN climate panel is telling us. It is a problem. And it will mean that by mid-century, by the end of the century, we will be much better off, but slightly less much better off than we otherwise would be. That's a very different sense of understanding. And I think that's the conversation that we need to have